All right, our second PowerPoint is going to be about the Gilded Age, which, give or take, kind of ends at the late 19th century. It's called the Gilded Age because it kind of comes from Mark Twain's idea of a gilded lily. Um, just kind of saying, even though something is gilded, let's say in gold on the outside, it looks nice on the outside, but on the inside it's going to get rotten. And that's kind of why some people call this the Gilded Age, because quite a few people made a lot of money, but at the same time, this is when there was discrepancy between rich and poor really started to become apparent in this country, and a lot of people argue that it's still apparent today. So that's why it's called the Gilded Age. Actually, one of the more famous, I guess you would say, human rights activists of the time was Chief Joseph, who we all know is from around here. Joseph, Oregon. You go over Chief Joseph Pass and all that in between here in Joseph, Oregon, and he was a very educated man. He talked with a lot of United States politicians, and he basically came up with this thing. He talks about how white people think that Native Americans are animals. They have more words than we do, but we speak through our hearts. You brought war, lied, stole our cattle. We gave you land for peace, etc., etc. And then he goes on to say how all their lands has been stolen from them, and he basically says all we want to do is live in peace and give everyone all the rights and the laws because we are all made by the same Great Spirit Chief. So his idea of freedom was this: I am only asking to be treated as all other men are treated, and if I am treated that way, I will obey the law. Okay, so you can already see how the idea of freedom is shifting, even from this very eloquent man, Chief Joseph, who ends up getting hunted down by the U.S. Army. Also at this time, the beginnings of this Gilded Age, is something called social Darwinism, and I think hopefully most of you have heard of Darwin before and his ideas of survival of the fittest and things of that nature. Well, in Europe in the 1850s and 1860s, a lot of people, and when Europeans were starting to dominate Southeast Asia, India, China, and Africa, this idea of social Darwinism came up, and it really came to the forefront in America with this guy named William Graham Sumner. And his whole idea of freedom is that you have to accept inequality because that's what freedom is. He says man is born to struggle to get what he deserves. And a man is at the top of this struggle, and when he can supply for the dependent organisms on him, so the organisms that are dependent on him, which William Graham Sumner is talking about a wife and children, right? He's talking about a family, but he's putting it in kind of chauvinistic scientific terms. His idea of freedom is security. And he says you gain security when you get exactly back how hard you've worked. So he's basically saying there is inequality, not everybody is equal. And he says what civil liberty does is turn the competition of man with man from violence to an industrial competition under which men start to vie for material goods and natural resources, by energy, by industry, by skill, frugality, prudence, etc. He says the man who is willing to fight for natural resources will come out on top, and he says that's what freedom is. And so that's his social Darwinism idea. Underneath that, there was a labor rights man by the name of Ira Stewart, and his idea of freedom, this is when labor rights really come to the forefront because the Industrial Revolution is hitting America, and it's moving west, especially with the railroad. Like I said, watch Hell on Wheels if you're interested in stuff like this. It's a bit violent, but it kind of gets unviolent at the end. Ira Stewart talks about things that need to change, and he says really what freedom is getting paid for how much you work and having leisure time to enjoy your life. It's a very Marx driven idea, right? People who work hard should get paid for how hard they work, and they should also have leisure time to enjoy their lives and enjoy their families. And if you do that, they'll be happier, they'll have more money to spend, which will make them buy more stuff, meaning the economy will turn. It's kind of also Reagan trickle-down economics, which we'll discuss way later in the class, right? You give people money, they'll spend it, and it'll trickle down through the economy. All right, so you can see that the idea of freedom is not about slavery anymore, but it's about being wealthy or being poor. And what these guys, whether they're social Darwinists or labor rights leaders, are saying is you're either rich or you're poor, and that's how you define freedom. If you can do what you want to do, that means you're free. All right. And along with this, and we'll discuss a lot more about the progressives later because it's a huge movement that sweeps the nation, is this guy named Henry George, and he writes this book called Progress and Poverty. And his idea is freedom is giving a man an opportunity to fulfill his human rights. And along these same lines with Ira Stewart, he says really inequality is injustice. So really what you need to do is you need to distribute the wealth. When you're not given we find these truths a self-evident thing, like land. When you don't have land, then you're not free. His argument is liberty is justice. It's the law. It's the law of being healthy. It's a law of being strong, and fraternity, being a part of community, and cooperation. He says that's what justice is. He's all about spreading the money around. He says, don't send your kids to school and then when they get out of school and they're educated, not have enough jobs for them. He says that's not liberty. Everybody needs to be fruitful and they need to do something for the community. Okay, it's all about fraternity. Edward Bellamy, he writes a book called Looking Backward, which was very popular in the 1870s, 1880s. And it's about this person named Julian West who falls asleep and wakes up in the year 2000, right? Where everybody cooperates and there's no strife or competition and there's no inequality. Inequality was actually banished. It was a law, and it was followed. And his idea of freedom was a social condition resting on interdependence, not on autonomy, right? Social Darwinism, Ira Stewart says, you need to be yourself, you need to work hard, and that is free because you will enjoy the fruits of your labor. Edward Bellamy is saying that's not true. What's real freedom is when the state can guarantee your safety, and the state can guarantee your economic security. The book it's an interesting book because it talks about wealth not being individuals but kind of spread out. It's all about being against monopolies and consolidation of capital. No person, and when he says person he means man, women, or child, he's not just talking about white males, is dependent on anyone else in the year 2000, which was a far cry from the 1880s, right? And he says really everyone is working for the nation. So in a sense he's kind of discussing the same things these guys are, but he's talking more about a utopia, kind of a socialist utopia kind of place where everybody's free and everybody's working together and, things of that nature. Free education, free health care. Nobody dies because they're poor or sick or they're hungry or they're thirsty or any of that, right? It's a utopian model of what freedom is. And this was a very popular book back in the day. And lastly, real quickly, there's also something called the social gospel, which was created by this guy named Walter Rauschenbusch. It's basically liberation theology, which is very popular in South America today and across the world. And what liberation theology means is Jesus was poor and he helped the poor. And this is something that is very, very anti-Protestant at the time. Protestant meaning Lutherans or evangelical Christians or any Christian who's not Catholic, because at the time, in the 1870s and 1880s, a lot of Protestant preaching was about, if you're poor, that's because you're lazy, you're sinful, and you're a drunk, right? I think at the end of the century, when we talk about prohibition, this is one argument that women will make, is that when men get drunk, they become lazy, they become sinful, and they stop doing their jobs. They start beating their wives, which has a ring of truth. All of those have a ring of truth to them. And so that whole idea kind of comes from this Protestant ideal of, if you're poor, there's a reason for it, because this is America. If you want to work hard, you will make money. Okay, and so the social gospel saying that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said you need to help the poor, and it's not their fault. That's what this social gospel meant. So, this Walter Rauschenbusch created houses for the poor, child labor, which was very large at the time, single moms, etc. His whole idea was a freedom as not living life looking to heaven, when we should really, what we should be doing is trying to make earth as clean and sweet and habitable as possible. And he also talks about giving people a fair wage and not charging so much for bread and not charging so much for meat, and making sure that everybody has food on their table. And another argument he makes is that men will do the right thing when they want to. All right, he talks about that's what freedom is. When people are happy and they're given a choice of what to do, in the end, they will make the right choice. And he says that's what freedom is. So those are some examples of the changing ideals of freedom. The one thing that these are all different. None of these people are talking about the difference between being free and being a slave. Okay, that has already changed in the American ideal of freedom from only 10 years ago. So let's get some context at how fast and quick American growth was by the 1880s, and kind of some of the reasons why. Some background: in the year 1886, that's the year of the Statue of Liberty, and you also get a whole bunch of upheaval of strikes, of worker strikes, and these are ruthlessly put down by the police. People are killed in Chicago, Detroit, New York, everywhere. So it's kind of this interesting dichotomy between the French sending over the statue saying America is the beacon of liberty, while in a lot of places the police are killing people indiscriminately. Okay, kind of rings true in some ways today, but in other ways not so much. So what's going on in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s in America is what people call the Second Industrial Revolution. It was one of the most rapid and profound industrial revolutions in the history of the world, the one that happened in America. I mean, and the reason for this is, as you know, it's a huge, huge country. When people come here from other countries, especially Europe, they just have no idea of the vastness of America, right? So it has good natural resources. It has good labor supply. There's so many markets that you can expand to that haven't been tapped for manufactured goods. There's capital for investment. The government encouraged research and development very much so at this time. There were high tariffs, meaning things coming into the country cost a lot of money, but exports did not. So the United States already was exporting more than it was importing by the 1880s. And they were using the army to move west and to settle people. So the government was financing the destruction of the Native American land while encouraging people, paying people to build ditches, to irrigate. The government was paying for the railroads, things of that nature. Okay, and this is kind of just some of the reason why the United States had this huge second industrial revolution. Factories, mines, railroads, means there was this move in around the 1880s from Lincoln's time of the small farm / artisan workshop to mature industry, right? So from the years 1860 to 1880, there's this really large movement of being a small farmer, owning your 5 acres, making 3 chairs a year and selling them, and raising your own cattle, to these huge industrial centers for the time, St. Louis, Chicago, moving west, Minneapolis, places of that, Cincinnati, where instead of having your 5 acres, you moved into town to get a job to support your family. So there's this big, rapid change in only about 20 years in American society. And so by 1880, for the first time in U.S. history, there were more industrial workers than farmers. By 1890, two-thirds of Americans worked for wages and not for themselves or owned a farm, which is just an astronomical number when you consider the movement west was all about farming, right? All about getting your 10, 20 acres and making a life out of it. This had already changed, and it had only taken 20 years. From 1870 to 1920, the working class, 11 people moved to cities, and another 25 million people immigrated into the country. Right, so there's this huge surge of labor and this huge surge of people who will work for basically peanuts, right? And then you also get this creation of national markets, and the people who created these national markets are the railroads, because for the first time in U.S. history, you could order something in St. Louis and it could come from New York and it wouldn't take 6 months. They would put it on a train and it'd be there, in 3 or 4 weeks. But I mean, a whole national market, meaning cities became connected. There's this whole interconnectedness to America now, and it's all due to these railroads. Which, by the way, I read in The Economist fairly recently that the United States, by far in the world, still has the best rail system for moving goods in the world. Because most other countries use their railroads to move people, whereas in America, we all drive our cars everywhere, and we use our rails for the most part to move goods. And the United States still has the best rail service in America, or in the world, to move goods. The amount of railroads triples in 20 years from 1816 to 1880, and it triples again by 1920. So the U.S. is getting pocketed with railroads at an unbelievable pace. In 1883, the reason why we have time zones today is because the railroads. They cut the country into 4 time zones to make things easier, to make business easier. I think Russia just changed theirs from 8 time zones to 10 time zones because it's so big. You get national brands like Ivory Soap, Quaker Oats, Montgomery Ward's, Sears, etc. And all of these are due to the fact that people are moving and they need products. If you're living 20 miles outside of St. Louis, you don't have a Sears near you, so you have to order parts from Sears in St. Louis. Sears has to order parts from New York, and then those parts come to St. Louis, and then they come to you, right? So that's the interconnectedness of the national market. And at this time, the United States was so innovative. They put a cable in the Atlantic by 1866 to communicate with Europe. We had the creation of the phone, the typewriter, cameras. You have Edison and the light bulb, motion picture, generating electricity. These are all things that are coming to fruition in the United States, and they're being invented here. All right, so there's this huge influx of innovation and science and people moving west, and it was an exciting time for people to live. And at the same time, you have these people called robber barons, and you've probably all heard of them. These are people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Standard Oil, people like this, and we'll talk about a couple of them. But basically what these guys are is, before there were antitrust laws, competition meant consolidation. Okay, so the market was flooded with goods, so the prices go down, and the competition was ruthless. So what they would do is they would form pools, these people who are selling the same products, and they would divvy up and they'd fix prices. Okay, so if you sell railroad ties, you would get together with all the other railroad tied businesses and say, all right, let's put our differences aside. We're losing money here, so let's all charge the same for our railroad ties, so they have to pay us that. If we keep competing with each other, we'll just keep driving the prices low, and then we'll all be losing money. So that's kind of what these trusts were. These trusts were legal devices where several rival companies could be managed by one director. And so eventually, this is how you get U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, International Harvester, as in international today, and how you get people like Carnegie and Rockefeller. And these are the guys who come from nothing and move their way to the top, and they become the leaders of these huge. Vanderbilts are another one. At the same time, in the 70s, there was no personal income or corporate income taxes. So in 1873, Carnegie comes up with this vertically integrated steel company that controls every part of the steel making process, right, from top to bottom. So what he does is he buys from the mining, from the transport, the manufacturing, and the distribution. All of it falls under the Carnegie U.S. Steel Company. All right, so there's no middlemen, there's no contracting out to other companies. They own it from top to bottom. Kind of like today, I would liken it to the New York Yankees owning their own TV station, right? So all the advertisement, all the money they make, they would lose to another company who has a different TV station. They just own it. Okay, so it's kind of the same idea. And with this, Carnegie hires the most brilliant people he can find: geologists, scientists, anthropologists, all kinds of people, to make this very technologically advanced company. But the thing about Carnegie is he kind of gets a bad name because he really was a philanthropist, and he really didn't worship the idea of money. He just loved power. Because at the same time, he was a dictator in essence, and his factory worked nonstop 2 12-hour shifts, right? The factory, the mining, it never stopped, not even for Christmas, not even for Easter, Thanksgiving, except for one day, and that was the 4th of July. But Carnegie today there's still millions and millions of dollars given away every year by the family for education, sending kids to college, all kinds of things. Another one was Rockefeller. He was a clerk in Cleveland, kind of like George Steinbrenner. Speaking of the Yankees again, George Steinbrenner came from Cleveland, ship guy. And by the 1880s, he made Standard Oil. So Carnegie was U.S. Steel, Rockefeller Standard Oil, vertical, much like Carnegie did, and he also gave much of his fortune away, especially for education and medical research. Today, the Rockefeller Research Endowment, it just gives millions and millions of dollars away. But at the same time, he did things just like Carnegie. He made sure that people worked hard under him, and he bitterly, bitterly fought against unionization. Okay, so Carnegie and Rockefeller, some of these guys get a bad rap every once in a while, but they did give back at times, and they created the America we know today. I mean, if it weren't for these guys, there wouldn't have been railroads, there wouldn't be gas, there wouldn't be oil as much, I mean, these guys really, really were the leaders of industry at the time. Some people call them the captain of industry. So captains of industry or robber barons, it just depends on which side you're on, right? One's kind of has good connotations, one kind of has negative ones. So at the same time, what we're getting at is distribution was uneven, but it did create new forms of freedom. Economic independence largely was based on skill, not capital. You did begin to see the beginning of unions, whether you're for them or against them. Into today, they are still. This is kind of where you kind of get the idea of people getting together and saying we wanted to be treated better and paid better. And and they really knew a lot about what they were doing. For instance, the one large reason why unions came into effect was because in between 1880 and 1900, 35,000 workers died a year in factories for Standard Oil, for U.S. Steel, for places like this. I mean, when you break that down outside of the numbers, that's basically 100 people a day almost are dying. So, um, and you also get this idea of tramps and whole families had to work to get by, things like that. So there's kind of this that's the lily part of the Gilded Age. The robber barons and this innovation and all of this technological advances and economic freedom are the gold on the outside of the lily. And on the inside of the lily, there's a lot of poor people. And there's a lot of families who everyone had to work, and there's a lot of deaths in factories. For example, by 1890, the richest 1% of America owned more property than the remaining 99%. So there was, even by 1890, there were the one percenters. All right, so this slide we're going to start talking about the movement west, and it was this vast trackless space with, Native Americans, and the whole idea of the West keeps shifting, right, in American history. At one point, it was to reach the Appalachian Mountains. Then it was to get over the mountains. Then it was kind of to start farming the Midwest. Then it was to get to the Mississippi. And then it was to get on the other side of the Mississippi and get to the Rockies. And then it was to get over and through the Rockies with Lewis and Clark and to the Pacific. And then once they got to the Pacific, it was about farming land and finding gold. So this whole idea of moving west keeps evolving. And you have to remember, people moving west, it wasn't just white people. There were Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese immigrants, whites, freed slaves. I mean, it was this whole hodgepodge of people who were moving west looking for better options. And really what ends up happening after the Civil War is people start really pouring into where the Mississippi is, kind of the Mississippi Delta and the floodplain, because there's good soil there. And even despite the Indian Wars that the U.S. Army was fighting against the native peoples, people just flood there. And 30 years after the war, there was more land cultivated around the Mississippi River than there was the previous 250 years. So it really, really starts to be subjugated. A lot of this has to do with the Homestead Act. We won't talk too much about the Homestead Act because it was done during the Civil War, but basically what the Homestead Act was in 1862, the U.S. government said any man who did not bear arms against the U.S. federal government, meaning the North, could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. So the government sent surveyors out and cut the land into 160-acre parcels. But if you lived there and claimed it, you were supposed to improve it by living there and cultivating the land. So that means, if you needed to irrigate. If you needed to clear trees or clear whatever, you had to do that. And after 5 years, if you did what you were supposed to do, the land was yours free and clear, except for a small fee. Okay, so that's what the Homestead Act was. And that's why all of these people begin moving west. It's basically free land. You just got to work for it. Kind of the American dream, right? So the middle border states, we're talking Minnesota, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, kind of the Midwest. The population was around 300,000 in 1860, and by 1900 there were 5 million people living in those states, which surprisingly, the most diverse state in the Midwest in the 1900 was North Dakota, if you can believe it. But these are not easy places to live, especially before before electricity got there, and before under plumbing and cities and things that we take advantage of today. It's very cold in the winter and it's very hot in the summer. You had there were a lot of warring Native American tribes in that area, the Sioux, for example. And it was a very hard place for women to live because they had to work from sunup. The men did as well, but women, a lot of the times they were pregnant or had just given birth, and they were up doing backbreaking work, working just as hard as men during the day. It was a very hard place for a woman to survive. Um, uh, a good show about this maybe would be Lonesome Dove, if you ever are interested in kind of seeing what the Midwest was like during this time period. Lonesome Dove's a good show. It kind of gives you a good idea, and it kind of shows you, or Open Range as well. It's kind of this idea that um, after the Civil War, this was kind of the heyday for cowboys. There were cattle drives. There wasn't a lot of private property in the West, so you could move tens of thousands of cows from Canada to Texas all the way through there, and not really touch anybody's land, and you could make a very good profit off of selling cows. You'd drive them to Chicago or whatever, and this is when the cowboys really became symbols of freedom and life in the West. But it was really hard work, and much like what happens anywhere, um, you have only a few bonanza farms, but mostly everybody else is working very hard for their 160 acres. And what ends up happening is ranches keep getting bigger and bigger, and less people start owning more land. It's just like everything else. Ranches begin to consolidate. The open range kind of goes away, and really what happens is large ranchers and the railroad begin taking over all the land. So the cowboy had its heyday from about 1865 to 1885, and after that, the whole idea of a cowboy, the romanticized version of it, well, it becomes romanticized. It's not something that many people can do because it was too hard of a life. At the same time, the U.S. Army began subjugating the plains, and I'm sure most of you have learned a little bit about what happened, of Sheridan and Custer's Last Stand and things like that. So we won't go too deep into it, but yet you do have to understand that horses had already changed the way that human beings had lived, especially in America. Um, most Because before the Civil War, most in the West who were daring enough to go out to Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, places where the federal government had not really tamed it, found horses to be helpful pulling all of their stuff with them. There were no railroads, to take your stuff, so it was basically horse and cart, and they could use horses as trade with relations with the Indians. Horses were helpful because Native Americans loved horses, and so it was a good trading point. And in fact, a lot of the reasons why most white people or freed slaves or anybody moving west survived even one winter was through Native American help. They kind of showed them where to go. They showed them where to be in wintertime. They showed them where to be in summertime, because it's very inhospitable there on the plains during the wintertime and in the summer. But what ends up happening is people start moving, too many people coming in, and they start encroaching on the land, and that's when things start getting hairy between a lot of Native Americans and settlers, because they start taking land from Native Americans. So when that happened, the U.S. Army was called in, and Ulysses S. Grant in 1869 sent one of his generals from the Civil War, Sheridan, and he comes up with this peace policy, and he sends Sheridan west. And basically what this peace policy in quotations means is it's much like how they ended the Civil War. They set out and they went village by village, and they set out to hammer them and annihilate them and burn them down, just kind of like they did through the South to end the Civil War. These are the same men who ended the Civil War for the North. They're also moving west. Okay, so these are hardened soldiers who take orders and do what they're told to do. And so they set out, they take horses, they start shooting buffalo. Kind of like Dances with Wolves, if you've seen that. They start taking the food supply, and buffaloes. Native Americans use buffaloes for everything. They start killing those and leaving them. They start stealing horses. They start stealing cows. They start killing people without remorse, and it's really this is the United States Army doing this on direct orders from the president. So what ends up happening is in 1800 there were almost 30 million Native Americans in what we would consider to be the United States today. By 1890, they were almost extinct. Okay, so this is a massive amount of killing, and I'm sure all of you have heard of it. And if you want to do your paper on Sheridan or Custer's Last Stand or Little Bighorn, whatever, go ahead, because we're not going to deal with it too much. It's just too much information. One band of Indians, of Native Americans I would like to talk about were the Nez Perce, which means pierced noses. We're all familiar with them because we live around them. If you live in the Idaho area, in 1877, O.O. Howard, the guy who led the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War, is sent out on a 1,700-mile chase to force the Indians who are the Nez Perce who are living up here to move to Oklahoma. It was fairly successful. A few survived and stayed here, but for the most part it was successful. And like I said, occasionally you'll get things like the Little Bighorn in 1876, where they killed 250 of Custer's men, and they actually win a battle. But really, they're just delaying the inevitable. The U.S. Army had so many people that, I mean, they knew that they weren't going to stop. And at the same time, from 1865 to 1890, you get 8 new states in the Union, right? As people move west, they create these states. And so the Native Americans can see the writing on the wall. Once something becomes a state, that means the federal government comes in full force and enforces laws and does things to basically remake the Native Americans' life. And so what ends up happening is they're sent to reservations, and these are places that aren't that nice of places. Farming's hard, it's hot, or it's cold, the soil's not good, there's not a lot of cover, they're not sent to these choice places. The reservations are purposefully made to be not that nice. Also, the Bureau of Indian Affairs really starts to take hold. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was created way back in the 1700s, but after the Civil War, this is when the Bureau of Indian Affairs really comes to the forefront. And basically what it is it's a treaty system set up that meant that the federal government treated each tribe, Native American tribe or whatnot, as a separate nation. And it was a federal government bureau that was supposed to help the relations between the federal government and the native population by building schools, making sure the federal government held to peace treaties, making treaties with tribes saying we won't take your land, or if we do, we'll buy it. You're not going to go to a reservation, etc., etc., etc. But what ends up happening is by the 1870s, all of this stuff is nulled and voided. And so what they do is the Bureau of Indian Affairs was then tasked to remove, in quotations, negative influences on tribes and families, meaning when they set up these new schools, the Native Americans were taught English. They had to wear non-native clothing. They were given new names, etc., etc. They were being assimilated. They were being Americanized, as opposed to being treated as their own distinct entity. So after the Civil War, this is when, especially as they move west, Native American life was completely transformed, and many of them, millions of them, were killed as well. And this is kind of what Zeke and Ned is about. If you want to read that book, it's a very good book. It's quick, especially the end, Zeke's perspective of the whole thing. That's what that book is about, kind of the relationship between Native Americans and white people after the Civil War and in Arkansas. Um, at the same time, in 1887, the Dawes Act was created, and what this was it broke up the land of nearly all the tribes into small parcels to be distributed to Native American families, with the remaining auctioned off to white people. So basically, what they're doing is they're coming into Sioux territory, for instance, and they're saying, well, this is historically kind of where the Sioux nation has lived and prospered and thrived. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut it up, give the families each a little parcel of land, and whatever is left over, which was usually the good stuff, we'll auction off and we'll pay, and we'll let the white people or anybody else who can afford it buy it. So basically it's the federal government coming in and taking land, parceling it up, and then selling the rest. Um, Native Americans who accepted this and adopted the habits of civilized life, in quotation marks, they would become citizens of the United States. So you had a choice, but the choice was either accept it or run or be sent to a reservation. And it was a total disaster for the Native American people. The loss of land, there was an erosion of culture. When the government made 2 million acres of Indian land available in Oklahoma, 50,000 settlers moved in there in a single day in April. I think the movie Far and Away is kind of about this. It ends with that, the Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman movie. Um, in the half century after this act was created, Indians had lost 86 million of 138 million acres of land. I mean, that is just astronomical. Um, and they reacted in different ways. Some fought, some ran to Canada, some sought solace in what is called the ghost dance, where they gather to sing and dance in the hopes of white men leaving, buffalo returning, and could return to customs free from the misery and the death and disease that the white people had brought with them as they moved west. And in this ghost dance, at one time there was a large gathering, and this is what happened at Wounded Knee Creek. It was a peaceful ghost dance, and what ended up happening is almost 200, mostly women and children, were killed. You could also do your PowerPoint on Wounded Knee if you would like. It was kind of a peaceful thing, symbol of what the Native Americans were trying to accomplish and return to life as they knew it. And 200 people, mostly women and children and old men, ended up being massacred. So that was really the last straw. This Wounded Knee is kind of the last time that Native Americans really felt like maybe they had a chance. Because by 1900, there's only 250,000 left. Of that, 530,000 were citizens. Or sorry, 53,000 were citizens. Congress had given 100,000 in Oklahoma citizenship. But the rest would have to wait until 1919 if they fought in the World War I, or 1924 when Congress made them all citizens. But the bottom line is this move west was devastating to the Native Americans, as most of you probably. All right, so quickly we're just going to go over some of the political movements of the time so you can kind of get a grasp of. This is kind of the time when a lot of people think of politicians of how some people think of politicians today. This is when the real lobbying and the corruptness kind of starts to eke its way into the United States governmental structure. Not that politicians aren't always corrupt, but this is when it really starts. The whole idea of Americans not really trusting their politicians starts here. Um, Corruption was rife throughout. In Pennsylvania, for instance, they had a third house, in quotation marks, of actual railroad lobbyists exerting as much influence in the government as the House and the Senate did in the Pennsylvania state legislature. Um, in the West, many lawmakers had stock in companies or were the directors of lumber, and the railroads were heavily subsidized. I know you're tired of hearing me say this, but watch Hell on Wheels. Perfect example of this, right? Of senators owning or being chairs on the board of a railroad committee. So what they do is they would siphon government money into these railroads and subsidize them, even though they're supposedly private companies. This is kind of when this whole idea of doing favors for your friends and trying to get public money into private investment really starts happening. A perfect example of this and something that you can do your PowerPoint presentation on is a guy named Boss Tweed. I'm sure all of you may or may not have heard of him, some of them. He ran Tammany Hall in New York City, very famous for its corruption. He created this huge political machine that plundered the city of millions of dollars. So they were in every neighborhood, and he was supported by the immigrant poor because he kind of had his own private setup of welfare, of food and fuel and jobs. But what you had to do was you had to vote for him, right? And you had to pay, so to speak, taxes to him, but what we would consider tribute. Um, they would go around getting people drunk and telling them who to vote for during election days, or they would scare people into not voting, things like that. I mean, he is very well known for that. So he was kind of an urban Robin Hood of sorts, but eventually he gets ousted in the early 1870s by people who are tired of paying tribute to him, right? He kind of said, I'll help the poor, but in return you have to help me," and people kind of got tired of it. He's just one example of this corruption. Um, at the same time, you had kind of this politics were in the dead center. Believe it or not, from about 1868 to 1900, the Republicans were favored heavily, and a lot of it had to do with because of the commonsensical ideals that they undertook. I know it's hard to believe with the Tea Party and all of those things happening today, and the mistakes that all our politicians on the left and the right make. At one time, the Republican Party was very much favored for being very commonsensical. Commonsensical in the sense of trying to use public funds to build roads, to build infrastructure, to build schools, to hire policemen, to hire firefighters, to hire teachers, helping people get educated. That kind of common sense kind of thing, not setting up pensions for veterans, things like that. But at the same time, it was really hard for either party to gain a real stronghold, because the South and the North were still very heavily divided. But at the same time, the whole idea of the United States political structure was very healthy because from 1868 to 1900, about 80% of the people who could vote did vote, which is astronomical. I don't even know what it is today. Maybe 45 to 50% of the people vote for their president who are able to. It's very low, not to mention who knows about city politics and state and things like that. Um, Even with that said, it was still a very small government, federal government, by the end of the century. Um, Republicans wanted to make tariffs high, so it was very expensive to import goods, and so spend low and pay off debts that they owed. The Democrats opposed high tariffs, but remained heavily associated with financiers to pay off the loans that the federal government was creating. So it's kind of an interesting idea that what these two stood for not that long ago. At the same time, the federal government really was trying to crack down on corruption. They created the Civil Service Act of 1883, and this was due to James Garfield's assassination by a worker. There's another PowerPoint presentation you could do. James Garfield was assassinated. I don't know if you guys knew that or not. And this Civil Service Act was a merit system for all federal employees. With your appointment, you could only be appointed via exams rather than who you know. So this very, very heavily cut it down on corruption. We kind of live in a world where everybody has to take an exam to be put where you should be put, but this is a fairly new idea in the United States. And in 1887, in response to outrage over how corrupt the railroads were, which they were just astronomically corrupt in every sense of the word, the federal government created the ICC, which is the Interstate Commerce Commission, and it made sure that rates that were charged to farmers and merchants who were trying to transport their goods or get goods from the railroad were charged reasonable fares, and it did not favor one person over the other. So what was happening is the railroads would get investors in the West, and the people who invested in the railroad could move their goods for cheap, whereas just the regular, John Smiths of the world who couldn't invest in the railroad but still needed their products would be charged exorbitant amounts on the railroad. There were no set prices, right? 100 pounds of timber for one person, would go for 5 cents a pound. Somebody else, it would be $1 a pound, right? So there was no set prices, and it was just completely corrupt. So what the ICC was, which is kind of important, it was the first federal agency in the United States intended to regulate any type of economic activity. This is the first time the federal government actually steps in and starts trying to regulate some part of the market. But it could not regulate the rates itself. It tried to. It was too hard. So it was somewhat limited, but at the same time, it's an idea, and it's an idea that we'll keep moving forward with. But just to end the politics, I know it all sounds corrupt and it all sounds bad, but overall, the federal government at this time was trying to create a better country for people. It had invested a lot in the North and the South in public works projects, park construction, sewers, water, gas, trying to get electricity out to the boonies, which we take for granted today, but at one point most people in America did not live with electricity. So at the same time, although there is corruption, many people who were running for politics and who wanted to be politicians actually did it because they wanted to serve the public better. Okay, even though we touched upon it a little bit, lastly, we're going to talk about freedom real quickly again, and just kind of some things that are starting to simmer, especially things around labor. The whole social problem of rich and poor this is when it really becomes a broad public discussion. There's pamphlets preaching things on land taxation, currency reform, ethical, social ideals of change, and you really started hearing discussions of a better class and a dangerous class. And there's bitter labor strikes all over. And when we're talking about dangerous class, this happens in Europe as well around this time. And the dangerous class is basically the working class people. So it's this kind of Darwinism idea of there is just some groups over others, and it kind of justifies slavery in a free society, so to speak. And it begins to explain the success of classes. Plants and animals are best suited for their environment that they live in, so those that do not adapt die. And we've kind of already talked about this, but then it starts to go into the thing about not just human beings, but corporations. It's like corporations were better suited than mom and pop stores, and that is why they are beginning to succeed. There's this whole idea of don't look to your government for aid. Teach your kids how to adjust to their environment, especially if you're a working class. Overwhelmingly, all of them said. At the same time, this is and those contracts are followed. Okay, a very business-like interpretation of freedom, and one that kind of starts to gain ground in the 1880s and the 1890s. And I think a lot of people today feel the same way. And it all kind of deals with this overwhelming labor question in parentheses. And this is kind of the shift, right? When we started class, the shift was slavery. What to do with all of these, with the 4 million freed slaves, and now it's what to do with all of these people who are poorly paid, who are upset, who live in squalor, who have bad bosses, who work too hard, and who are dying, and they're starting to grumble, and they're starting to strike, and they're starting to unionize and get together and say, hey, this isn't right. So this is kind of the question. It moves from slavery to this one. And in 1877 was the first really, really huge strike in American history, and it was the Great Railroad Strike. And what they were protesting was a pay cut to their wages, to their hourly wages, and this literally paralyzed the country, right? Railroads were the heart and soul of the country by the late 1870s, and this paralyzed trade from New York to St. Louis to Minneapolis to Texas to the South to the North, everywhere. And so what happened was the militia was sent in to force them back to work. The Great Railroad Strike was all across the country. It wasn't just one city. So, for instance, in Pittsburgh, 20 people were killed by the militia. Workers began burning railroads, lifting up railroad ties, attacking factories, millions and millions and millions of dollars in damages, which back then was a large amount of money. Chicago and St. Louis had huge strikes as well, where this is a picture of the strike in Chicago. I don't know the exact numbers of how many people died, but it was a very violent strike, and the reaction to it was violent as well. These big corporations, these big railroad companies who had government lobbies in the government, and a lot of people in the government who invested in these big railroad companies knew that something had to be done, and so their reaction to it was to send in the militia, and things got violent. And this is why today, if you ever notice when you go around the United States and other places in a lot of cities have armories in America now, and this is what it comes from. For if there was social unrest again on this level, that a city militia or National Guard or the Army who was stationed there would have the weapons and the means necessary to combat these types of outbreaks. It's very European, right? Very, very Parisian French to strike. But this is why if you see armories around cities, this is the reason why they are there. At the same time, you had groups like, for example, lots of unions, but we'll just use one example, the Knights of Labor. And they were really the first group to try and organize unskilled and skilled workers, women, and freed slaves. The only people that they did not want in were Asians. And these were mainly Chinese immigrants working on the railroad. But they were for the first time not just for skilled workers, which would be men, not for just skilled and unskilled, which would also be men, but they also allowed women and freed slaves, African Americans as well, and their progeny. In 1886, they had almost 1 million members, and basically what they were asking for were 8-hour days, and they really questioned whether a human being could be free in such a lopsided economic situation, right? We had already discussed about how most of the land and the wealth in the country was getting consolidated into the hands of a few. And so the Knights of Labor were really, really saying, can there be equality? Can there be freedom? Can a person work for 8 hours a day and make, if he or she works this long, make an adequate salary so that they can have time off and enjoy their life? Right? That definition of freedom we talked about earlier. What ends up happening with the Knights of Labor is the Haymarket Affair, which was May Day, May 1st, 1886, which is also, as we talked about earlier, the same year of the Statue of Liberty. Some 350,000 people demonstrated for an 8-hour day, and Chicago was hit the hardest of all. This was a demonstration held throughout the country, but Chicago had the highest. And by the 3rd of May, 4 people had been killed by the police. So on the 4th of May, they rally in the Haymarket Square, and that's kind of when things get violent. 3 leaders were arrested. Their houses were raided. Factories were raided. They were trying to find proof of who the leaders were and who was involved and arrest them. And they ended up arresting 8 anarchists. 4 of them hanged. One committed suicide, and 3 spent 7 years in prison. Overall, many people died, and it was just kind of this end of the Gilded Age where the American dream was seen as, you work hard, you get paid, you earn what you make, and then you can do with that money what you want to do with it. You can invest it, you can put it under your bed, you can put it in a bank, you can do all of these things. And really what these unions and these workers were trying to do was their definition of freedom, is being able to work and get paid a living wage. And what ends up happening is violence. America had never seen people get together like this before, and so nobody really knew how to react, and the only reaction that they had was a violent one. And a good example of that is the Haymarket Affair.